Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. It's good to be here. Good to see everybody. Thank you for being here. Wednesday nights are not easy. Tina and I were doing a couples retreat weekend several years ago in Gatlinburg, and I remember some discussion we had, and there was a young mother who came up to me and she said, "I hate that song." And I said, "What song are you talking about?" And she said, "You know that song." And I said, "What song are you talking about?" And they had 2 or maybe 3 young children to preface me telling you what the song was. And she said, "That song, Easy Like Sunday Morning. There's nothing easy about Sunday morning when you have 3 kids and getting them ready for church." And I know Wednesday nights are similar, and so thank you for being here. I hope that it will be helpful to you. Hope you've had a good week. We've had some good rain. Grass is growing. When you've got cows, you pay attention to things like that. And so a wet August is good for several of us. But that's not why we are here tonight. So we're talking tonight about a second lesson on parenting. And I want to once again give my disclaimer. And in fact, I had a 5 o'clock counseling session this afternoon that I ran out of to come over here. And the biggest part of that hour was spent in talking about how to deal with a child and the grief and the anger and the frustration that went with that. Raising children is not easy. It's very difficult. And as I said last week, God gives us one of the most important jobs we could have and asks us or expects us, commands us to do the best we can do in that role, having almost no experience. And seriously, actually no experience when that first child comes along. And so we learn as we go. And I don't know of anybody who has it all figured out, and I certainly don't. However, I want to share some things that I think I have seen to be true, and certainly want to be helpful in doing this. I'm stumbling through this trying to make sure I got my remote on. So tonight we want to begin again, as we will each week, with what God has to say, and we're going to look at the same passages we began with last week, just reminding us of the blessing that God gives us of children. They are indeed a heritage from the Lord, and offspring, a reward from Him. And for those who want so badly to have them but have not been able to, they truly understand what a blessing children are and would be for them if they were able to enjoy that blessing. But let's go ahead and look at the second. It's my goal to help us to raise our children in the same way that Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, and favor with God, and favor with man. I'll continue to use this passage to show that raising children who love the Lord and who are faithful to God in their adult years relies on us showing them that living for God involves obeying His commands at all times, not just on Sundays, not just on Wednesdays, and how we have a responsibility as parents of keeping God's expectations in front of those little eyes at all times, and how we as fathers especially have a responsibility to get our families to heaven and to raise our children in a way that they love the Lord instead of in a way that would involve our pushing them away. And so we're going to look tonight in an effort to help us as parents to do these things. We're going to look at 3 points. And the first one is that we need to be careful about overprotecting our children. And you'll see the main title of this week and next week. I have entitled these 3 points tonight and 3 points next week, Challenges in the 21st Century when it comes to parenting. And I believe that there is a big challenge. We live in a in a country that is very materialistic. We live in a very wealthy part of the world. Several years ago at Freed-Hardeman, I came to love a student from Nigeria who was in his 30s, left a family from Nigeria to come to study at Freed-Hardeman, Obadiah Doka. And Doka was such a great guy. He was somebody who came to the United States and never became materialistic, never became Americanized when it came time for him to graduate and go back home so he could go back home and teach the gospel to the people of Nigeria. He did that where many did not. And I understand why many did not. Doka told me one night, told all of us one night as we were driving back home after I had preached, when Carter said, "Dad, I'm starving. Can we stop and get something to eat on Sunday night on the way home?" And Doka said, "Oh, son, don't say that. You don't know what you're talking about." And I remember so vividly looking up in the rearview mirror of that Astro van and seeing little Carter's eyes about that big, as though he had told God he was not going to do something he was supposed to do with guilt. And Doka continued to say, there was one time that I went 7 days without anything to eat because I had to give the little bit of food we had to our children and my wife. And I remember when he came to the house for the first time to eat, and he looked around and he walked out back and he saw my tractor and he said, "Oh, if I had that in Nigeria, I'd be a millionaire." And I said, "Why, Doka? What would you do with it?" And Doka said, "Well, before I came here, I was a farmer." And I said, "You were a farmer? I didn't know that." And he said, "Yes." I said, "How much land did you farm?" He said, 10 by 10. And I said, 10 acres by 10 acres? And he laughed and he said, "Oh no, 10 feet by 10 feet. He said, "My job in Nigeria was to till 100 square feet with a hoe, and I grew vegetables and I sold them, and that's what we lived off of." Well, you didn't have to be around Doka very long to realize how blessed we are and how easy we have it. But the point that I want to make in this, and enjoying telling you about my friend Doka, but using that as a context thought, is for us to realize we really have to understand how easy it is for our children to grow up having things too easy. Well, let's continue. And some scripture. Look at this concept that Paul gives us first from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 10. And without reading it word for word, look at it and notice that phrase, "When I am weak, then am I strong." He talked about the thorn in the flesh. He talked about how oftentimes the things that are most difficult for us are the things that are best for us. Now, if I had time tonight to just open that up and say, all right, when in your life have you had or found that to be true? Things that were extremely difficult to go through, unbelievably difficult to go through in some cases, but those events, those situations caused us to be so strong, caused us to see what matters versus what doesn't, caused us to be better people. Well, let's continue. That's the thought here. Isaiah 30 and verse 20. Isaiah talks about what happens when we go through the fire or have the bread of adversity. And sometimes God sends adversity our ways, not always. Sometimes Satan does it. Sometimes it's the product of natural causes or natural processes. But though the Lord give you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, yet shall not thy teachers be removed into a corner anymore, but your eyes will be opened as the eyes of the teacher. When we go through difficult things, we become wiser. And look at verse 26 of the same chapter from Isaiah. Moreover, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 days, in the day that the Lord bindeth up the breach of his people and healeth the stroke of their wound. That's a lot of words. You have to look close, but when you look close, what you see is when we go through something that wounds us, if we handle it well, we will become enlightened. We will be taken to a new level. When older people lose spouses, lose family members, Brother Jerry and I were talking about that a few minutes ago, it makes it so much easier to understand life and the hereafter. That's an understatement, but very true. When I see older people, especially who lose spouses, who lose health, they get to that point that they're ready to go on. Why? Because they come to, through all of those series of events, a better understanding of what matters versus what doesn't, where home really is versus where the temporary home is. Now, I may be spending too much time talking philosophy, but the reason I'm doing it is to make the point it is the same with children. And when we try to protect them from things that are difficult for them, we are keeping their eyes closed and shutting off wisdom and the development of such. Peter took Isaiah's concept and said, in this, rejoice greatly. Now, the book of 1 Peter involved Peter writing to people that were persecuted, I think, beyond our ability to understand. And he had the job of trying to help them to put that in context, to the point that he said, in these hardships, there are positives. You can rejoice greatly, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. In verse 7 of 1 Peter 3, these have come so that your faith, which is worth more than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. For you are receiving the goal of your faith, the salvation of your souls. I'm going to continue to talk about the importance of our children's faith, but I want to go ahead and say at this point, you know what? If we lose our children's soul, or if they lose their soul, what matters more? And if I wanted to become emotional and grab our attention, I would start talking about what it would be like to be in the line at the judgment scene and our child is before us and we were to hear, "Depart from me, I never knew you." I don't even, I kind of went there for the purpose of encouraging you to think about it, but backing up pretty quickly again, the truth is there is nothing that matters more to me as a parent if I halfway have my priorities in order than making sure my children are safe with the Lord. And they're going to have to deal with some adversity and some difficulty for the purpose of doing that. And if we protect them from everything that's difficult, we may not be helping them reach that goal. Now, I want to read an article to you that I found this morning, and the first time I've used it, but it makes my point very well, I think. This is from Smart Kids 101, the organization. And so the author says, let me just say it right off the bat. As parents, we need to be okay when our kids face adversity. What, are you kidding me? She says, no, I'm not kidding. You read that right. Now let me explain. She says, my helicopter parent passed in the past. And then she says, granted, I'm coming from a been there, done that perspective. My children and stepchildren are all adults. My emptier nest has led to a less impulsive, more thoughtful approach to parenting, and I hope some helpful observations. Don't get me wrong, I certainly did my fair share of hovering. After all, it was the 80s. where helicopter parenting was as big as the hairstyles, I thought I was doing my kids a service. What I didn't understand was that my flyovers could actually harm their problem-solving techniques. However, 12 years into my parenting gig, I witnessed an event that forced me to give pause to the bad parenting habit I'd formed, and then she says, let me explain. My son was in the 2nd grade. He was a big kid, and by big kid, I mean he was seriously big, looked like a 5th grader. He came into the world huge. He stayed that way until high school, where he finally quit growing at 6 feet 3 inches. She says, I was volunteering in the elementary school office running copies for a PTA meeting. I looked out the window where the kids were congregating to get on buses for a field trip. Girls were talking and laughing, and the boys were engaging in some friendly horseplay. As I looked closer, I realized my son was being held by 2 boys on each side while another boy kicked him in the backside. I was furious. How dare these little pipsqueaks bully my large child? And she goes on to give her explanation as to why sometimes large children are bullied. But let's continue. So what did I do? I stood frozen at the copying machine, staring out the window and flushed with anger. Believe me, I wanted to go full mama bear mode on that little punk doing the kicking. But I hear that's frowned upon in the PTA. Whatever. And then she says, I considered my options. I could stand there, do my PTA busy work, and talk with my son later, or I could rush outside, catch the perpetrators in action, and march these 8-year-old hooligans straight into the principal's office. It even makes me shake my head as I write this. Believe me, I understand and completely sympathize with you. While everything in me wanted to rush to my son's aid, I thank God that I did not that day. Was I interested in how to help kids with conflict? You bet. You know I could have taught these boys a few things about manners, but I assure you that my son did not need his mom swooping in for the rescue. As difficult as it was for both of us, it was better for him to manage the situation himself and be able to talk about it with me. And then she ends by saying, kids can manage a little adversity quite well, and as adults we can help, not by protecting them from it, but by coaching them through it. Now, I'm not going to stand here tonight and tell you we need to go looking for adversity for our kids. But I am going to stand here tonight and say, oh, how careful we need to be to not protect them from anything that's difficult, because if we do, we are not preparing them for adulthood. I also looked this morning at some interesting studies that came out of Harvard a few years ago. And they talked about that word resilience, and they defined resilience as that which shows, or the studies of resilience show that exposure to early challenges which don't destroy us may actually enhance our ability to cope with future threats. I was kind of proud of something like that coming out of Harvard. What they were doing in actually 2 or 3 articles I found was defining resilience. What they were saying is a lot of kids who grow up who are resilient are those who had adversity but handled it well. Now I want to transfer that to what I do every week, if not every day. I have so come to believe that adversity does not destroy us if we handle it well, but it makes us better. That sometimes, in fact often in the counseling room, when someone will come and they will talk about their childhood and the difficulties of this or that, it's easy for me to start thinking immediately about, all right, how are you stronger because of that? And oftentimes I'm able to turn a bit of a negative into a bit of a positive by causing them to realize, you know what, I am a far better mother because my mother was not there like she should have been. Or I'm a far better father because my father was nowhere to be found. Sometimes couples will be in the counseling room and they will say, we will not argue in front of the children because at home the arguing was every day and was so loud. Well, it's an example of what I'm talking about. And obviously in that situation, it can go too far into shutdown mode. There can be problems, of course, dealing with adversity. But when we deal with adversity well, and when our children deal with adversity well, we and they come out stronger. Children who have forged through difficult childhoods may actually benefit from coping mechanisms that they had to find within themselves to get through difficult times. Psychology today. Wow, it's true. And I want to give some examples of this. First of all, children need to be taught that life's not fair. If it is our job to make sure that if our child is the best quarterback, he's on the field all the time, or if he's not, but we think he is, or if a teacher mistreats or misjudges in some way our child, and it's our place to fix that and to make it fair. And if we are constantly doing that, what's going to happen when our children grow up and become adults and mom and dad are not around to fix the unfair things that happen on a daily basis? And what if we show them that the way to fix it, and the only way to fix it, is to rectify it and don't give up until it's fair? Well, life's going to be miserable for us and for them. Number two, children need to learn to handle disappointment. Children need to learn to hear the word no. They need to learn to hear those words that all of us hated because Dad said so. That's just what I've decided. It's okay for you to not agree. It's important for you to understand what happens when things go the way that you wish it would not go. Number three, children need to be exposed to difficult situations and difficult topics. Why? Same line of thought. Because if they are protected until they become adults, they are not ready to become adults. Now, I completely understand and support the concept of age appropriateness. There are ways that we need to make sure that we're dealing with things in age-appropriate ways for our children. Bothers me, for example, when I hear a parent say, well, we don't want to take our children to the funeral home because that's hard. Or maybe a better example is, when we do church trips to the nursing home, that's very difficult for a lot of adults. You know why? Because they didn't grow up going to nursing homes. They weren't a preacher's son the way I was. Where it happened so often, it just kind of became something we did, and it didn't scare me to death. But if we don't grow up experiencing these things that are not always easy, then we're scared of them. We're afraid to try them. We don't know how to deal with these things. Now, I could keep on with this bullet list, but the last thing on this bullet list is, and how important it is for us to realize that children begin manipulating at a very early age. And when they don't want to do something, they have ways of making mom and dad feel like, oh, well, that's hard. We don't want to make them do that. Do you believe that children can manipulate at a very early age? Well, if you don't, meet 2 of my 3 grandchildren. Now, I love this part of the presentation because I get to show off 2 of my 3 grandchildren. But I want you to look closely. Do you think Charlie Kate knows what she's doing when she's got that head tucked sideways and leaning up against that? Oh, absolutely she knows. She is getting a desired response. How old was she on her first day of whatever the Mother's Day Out program was called? 2, a little over 2. And if that's not enough, look at Everett. He was not even 2 then, I don't think, was he, Tina? And what he learned was, if I tuck my chin down and I roll my eyes up, people go, "Aw, isn't that?" And they laughed and they hugged him, and, well, not they, we all did. But Pavlov and Skinner were right when they said we learn very early that when we get a response that is desirable, it reinforces behavior. Now, my point is this: kids learn very early to manipulate parents, and that especially comes into play when we are trying to help them to develop and to learn life lessons by doing something that's difficult. And if we don't believe that, which one did you go to when you wanted something, mom or dad? Every one of us who had mom and dad can answer that question. I mentioned that last week. We did learn that early on. Do kids manipulate? Sure. Will they manipulate us and cause us to not do what's best for them in exposing them to things that are difficult? Absolutely. But let's go to number 2. How good a job are we doing in helping our children when they make mistakes? Now, this one's kind of tricky because it almost sounds somewhat psychological in nature, and a lot of psychology that I taught for years I didn't care a whole lot for, and some of the psychoanalysis stuff I don't like. But you know what? We need to be careful how we handle our children when they make mistakes. And let's go ahead and start developing this. In fact, I need to speed up. When we create an environment in which perfection is expected, then we create an environment where our children grow up feeling inadequate. Now, let me try to make this real. Those my age grew up largely in a generation where our parents hid their mistakes. They didn't do a very good job of being open, being very transparent. And if they messed up, instead of saying, "I'm sorry," quite frankly, oftentimes they tried to cover it up, tried to act like it didn't happen. But you know what happened in that culture and what continues to happen in that culture? What happens in that culture is when we grow up with parents who act as though anything less than perfection is not okay, then the bar is so high that we never feel like we're good enough. And self-esteem comes into play, and guilt, and even what to do and how to handle making mistakes. One of the most important things we can do as parents is to admit our mistakes and to apologize, and I'll come to this in a minute, but learn to apologize to our kids when we make mistakes with them so that they will know, number one, that parents are not perfect, that they mess up, but number two, and maybe even bigger, what you're supposed to do when you mess up. But when we as parents act like we never mess up, when we never use the words, "I'm sorry," to our kids, we are treating them and teaching them that perfection is the goal. And that's not fair. And that's not good. And that's not developmentally helpful in any way at all. Dealing with mistakes properly doesn't give a license to mess up. It doesn't tell our kids it's okay for you to mess up, but again, it teaches them what to do when they do make those mistakes. And just kind of as a check, if you've got children at home, when's the last time you've told them you're sorry? And when's the last time you messed up toward them or related to them? Now, if I'm honest, for a lot of us, those two don't match, because it usually is very hard for parents to sit little Johnny or little Debbie down and say, "You know what, I was not handling that very well. I came home, I was tired, I was short with you. Man, I'm sorry. I'm going to work hard to do that, to do better next time. And not only does that teach them, I'm not perfect, I mess up. It teaches them what to do when we mess up. It makes them feel important because we are apologizing to them instead of forcing them to apologize to us, which happens 9 times out of 10. I think this is a bigger deal than we have treated it. And I think it comes into discussion of grace and how difficult it is for most of us to fully accept that concept. I think it deals with our expectations of ourselves and others. How important it is for us to show by example. And number 3, the third challenge tonight, the importance of the Lord's church in raising children to be faithful when they become their own decision makers. And how important it is for them to love God. And going back to how I began tonight, thinking about if we lose the souls of our children, we could lose nothing more. I want you to think with me about what happens to children when parents are half-heartedly committed to the Lord's church. Now, I want to preface this because we live in a difficult day. We live in a day in which all of us want to fight traditionalism and legalism. We live in a day in which the discussion of, do you have to go on Sunday night? Do you have to go on Wednesday night? Show me where that is in the Bible. We're only going to get our ticket punched. What does that mean? I understand all that. I realize that we can take any command of God and we can make it legalistic and do it for the wrong reason. I don't even want to deal with that angle tonight, though, because the angle I want to deal with tonight is this. When we as parents show our children that you can take or you can leave commitment to or involvement in the Lord's church by our decisions, then when our children grow up to be adults, 9 times out of 10, they're going to leave it. Why? Because they weren't taught the importance of it. And especially when they are in a situation in which they know as kids, you got to go to church, you got to act right, you got to do this, and we'll be punished if we don't. And then when it comes time for them to make their own decisions and they go to college, Sunday morning they get up and go, sometimes mom and dad went, sometimes they didn't. And now I can go or not, and really there's no punishment if I don't. Or in other words, because the false sense of motivation that the parents have given, they have no motivation at all to go. So let's develop this real quickly. When parents are half-heartedly committed to the Lord's church, Bible study and worship become something we endure. Most of us have felt that at parts of our lives, and we fight that sometimes. Sometimes it is something we have to endure, but when we're not committed to it, when we don't love it, when we don't see it as what it should be seen as, then it becomes a checkpoint for us. And when we are halfway committed, then we are operating generally out of guilt. And the church becomes a set of rules instead of a story of love, of God, the loving Father, giving His Son for me. And how He blesses my life every day and how He helps me through those hard times. How much bigger the Lord's church is than a set of rules. What happens to the family who is half committed to the Lord's church? Children learn that you do what you do out of duty instead of out of love. And when these children grow up, they have little or no motivation. And again, getting back to what I said earlier, when they have seen mom and dad take it or leave it, if it's easy to leave it, if it's easy to not be involved, if they are always saying no when asked to do something to the point that nobody asks anymore, if they are gone enough that people don't miss them, and it's about way more than attendance, it's about involvement, it's about commitment. When that happens, then the children learn it's just not that big of a deal. I realize the need to be careful with legalism, but I cannot diminish the value of the Lord's church when it is the bride of Christ and the family of God. I can't do it. If Jesus died for it, I can't act like it doesn't matter. And if I teach my children by my example how important it is, because it truly is, they're going to grow up realizing that there's value to it. But what about the contrast? What happens to children when parents are completely committed to the Lord and His church? Now, I'm talking generally. I realize that our children make their own decisions, and some with parents who truly were committed to the Lord's church will fall away. I understand the concept of free moral agency and how I'll be judged based on my decisions and not the decisions of my parents. But generally speaking, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. And when we are committed to the Lord's church as we ought to, what about our children? Well, children grow up without having to make the decision whether or not the church is important. I don't want to become overly personal in this, but I will tell you, when I went to Freed-Hardeman in 1979 as an 18-year-old, on Sunday morning, I never thought about whether or not I would go that Sunday morning. Now, I went and slept through some of it. I went and probably thought about the next baseball game we would have, or teacher I didn't like who was sitting 2 seats in front of me, or all those things, or how good Tina looked that day. Better get that one in, shouldn't I? Those things that 18-year-olds think about, but I never thought about whether or not I needed to go. Why? I was just taught it's that important. Secondly, children grow up practicing and instilling commitment to the Lord and His church. Number 3, children grow up seeing God as a loving Father instead of a punisher, wanting to be with Him, wanting to take advantage of His blessings, wanting to talk to Him. It's a whole different mindset. And that's your lesson. I have no idea. Can you get me back? In fact, the song service is over too, right? All right, thank you. Children also grow up around people who make it easier to do the right thing. We all have experienced that. We all know how easy it is to do the right thing when we're around a group of people who are doing the right thing and who encourage us to do that. So, really, the important question here that I haven't saved much time for, but look at these points closely. So what do we do? What can parents do to instill the importance of the church to their attendance? First of all, make worship and Bible study automatic, not a decision. Just do that. Why? Because of what we talked about tonight. What bigger thing could we lose? And what matters more in life than our children being committed to the Lord? Secondly, make the church positive, not negative. It's so very easy for us to build ourselves up by criticizing others. And it's so very easy for us to go out to eat on Sunday or go home and at Sunday lunch for us to pick apart what happened at church that Sunday morning or at worship that Sunday morning if my dad's listening, and make sure that I say things the way you're supposed to say them. Oh, what it's like to talk about how long the sermon was, or the way the song leader did this, or can you believe the elders are. But I want you to think about what's happening to those little ears when we are constantly doing that. What they are hearing is, ooh, why would I want to be a part of that? That's negative. It's not positive. Now, I understand there's no such thing as the congregation of the Lord's church that's perfect. There's no such thing as the perfect elder or the perfect minister or the perfect song leader, the perfect Bible school teacher. Brother Jerry told me a while ago, this church is a loving church that's not perfect but has gotten along well through the years. I loved hearing that, and I know enough to believe that. how important it is for us to show our little ones that this is a positive part of our lives, and if we're continually critical, we won't do it. And how do we teach commitment to our children? We teach by example, and we make sure that the church is the priority it should be. It's very interesting to me that I have the ability to put tons and tons of hay back for storage by completely doing all of it myself. And my grandfathers had to work so very hard to do 2 or 5% in terms of tonnage when they cut and baled hay. And how long it took them to milk the cows. And how hard they had to work to do this and to do that. But yet they were the ones who had time to sit on the front porch on Sunday afternoon and rest. Why did that happen? When we can make meals in microwaves in 2 or 3 minutes, when we can cut 10 acres of hay in an hour and a half, when we can, because we pack so much in 24 hours that we have very little time. And what suffers when we do that, at least in part, is our involvement in the Lord's church. And what do we teach our children when that's the case? Well, the church is a physical connection to the spiritual world. And it's hard enough for us to understand the spiritual. And oh, what a great lesson we teach our children when we show them the spiritual nature and the importance of the spiritual nature of the body of Christ, family of God, His church. Philippians 3, verses 8 and 9. It is our goal for our children to grow up and have their own faith, a faith of their own that's not mine, that's not forced on them, that is a faith they developed because they learned as they grew to love the Lord and His church. So we'll look at 3 more next week. I hope these were helpful to you. Tonight we offer the invitation song. We want to encourage you, if you need the prayers of this congregation, if you want to come tonight and ask this church to pray for you to help you be a better parent, a better husband, a better wife, or that you're struggling and just need the prayers of this church, we'd encourage you to come. Or if you want to go to one of the elders and ask them to pray with you, they'll be glad to do that. If you want to come tonight, we'd encourage you to do so while we stand and